think we're waiting for everyone to come in. I think we have a few more minutes before we get started. Is that right, Dan?
Yes, Ma'am Tina.
While we're waiting for everyone, maybe I can take this chance to introduce those who are on screen. We have, of course, our main presenter for this afternoon, Patrick Flores. Our guest artists who will be participating in the conversation, Yason, Banal, and Marx Alberto. We also have with us Manny Miñana, who is a trustee of the Met, and our supporters, Ria Brido from the coordinating committee of the Philippine Venice Biennale, and a representative from AGMAM, the vice president of AGMAM, Rica Estrada, and the Met team, who will be monitoring the webinar for this afternoon, Dan and Alec. They have been sending out the invitations and they have been in touch with everyone. I think we have a few, and Jason, who do we have here yet? Jason and, okay, I think that's about it. Leanne, okay, I think we can get started. Welcome, first of all, welcome, a warm welcome to all our friends, colleagues, and webinar attendees. I am Tina Colaiko of the Metropolitan Museum of Manila, and we are very delighted that you can join us this afternoon for the first webinar hosted by the museum in partnership with the Alliance of Greater Manila Area Museums, AGMAM, and with the valued support of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, NCCA, the Office of Deputy Speaker Loren Legarda, and the Philippine Arts in Venice Biennale Coordinating Committee. The museum, as understandably, remains temporarily closed since the March 16th lockdown. But in the midst of this COVID-19, we are very happy that we find ourselves coming together in this digital space, and our goal today to connect, to touch base, and to support each other through our love and affinity for the arts. We also feel a lot of renewed energy working together with colleagues and friends in a timely dialogue that would help us understand how art and culture is so intertwined with our lives in the best and worst of times. We thank the officers and the board members of AGMAM for their support and for playing an active role in the museum community during COVID. And I think it would be interesting to hear from AGMAM, from Rica. Maybe you can update us on what AGMAM is doing at this time, briefly. Rica?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I am speaking on behalf of Danny Alvarez, who's the president of AGMAM, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. So AGMAM is pleased to be a partner of the Met in presenting this webinar. This is actually a third in AGMAM's Museum Talks series online, which we envisioned to propel museum workers to have a continuous discussion about how to engage audiences, particularly during this problematic time. So the definition and role of museums have evolved recently as the changing times have dictated. So critical thinking has been the guiding principle in creating exhibits and museum programs. And AGMAM believes, of course, as our colleagues do, that museums must reflect the sentiment of the time. So AGMAM being conscious of the expanded role of museums, we've started to promote the articulation of a more meaningful conversations between the museum object and the visitor. So we are very excited to hear from our partners, this time with our visual artists who continue to share their meaningful work with our curators, museum curators, and we put across important important cultural themes and messages to our varied audiences. So again, thank you to the Met for this webinar, and we look forward to listening to all of our speakers this afternoon. So hi, Sir Patrick, and hi, Yason and Mark. Nice to see all of you.
Thank you, Rika. Thank you for the support. And before we move on, just a bit of a background on where we are coming from with this webinar. Before the lockdown, the museum had 2 ongoing major exhibitions, which have now moved on their online galleries. Arte Povera, the Italian landscape and cues from life itself, the Filipino Artists transforms the everyday. Arte Povera, the Italian landscape, curated by Italian art critic and curator Danilo Aiker, featured 12 Italian contemporary master artists who broke boundaries in traditional art, incorporating found objects in works that spoke of the socio-political milieus in the late 60s and early 70s. That particular experimental approach would be embraced, would be debated on, or would be refuted over time on many different levels. The art historical discourse it has engendered continues to the present and comes to the fore today at this webinar with Patrick Flores, the curator of Cues from Life Itself. Patrick Flores is known to many of us as professor, scholar, author, and the current curator of the UP Vargas Museum, and very much in demand for international biennales and contemporary art exhibitions. And this afternoon, he will share with us some insights drawn from both exhibitions and from works of artists who have given us valuable intellectual and emotional cues from life that ring true today. Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Flores.
Thank you, Tina, for the introduction, and thank you to the Met for this invitation for this webinar. I would like at the outset to talk about the curatorial context of the exhibition Cue from Life Itself, Filipino Artists Transform the Everyday. The Metropolitan Museum of Manila was organizing an Arte Povera exhibition, and it wanted a Philippine exhibition to respond to it. Such a desire for an exhibition alongside a project that came from overseas requires important curatorial decisions, which makes this presentation simultaneously a review of a method. The first issue, of course, was the obvious anxiety over the relationship between European and Philippine exhibitions. As if by reflex, the impression would be that the former is international and the latter is local. If one were to sustain this default notion, one would inevitably support the structural prejudice against Philippine art and in the same breath privilege the status of European art. It is as if the local is not linked internationally and that the foreign is not rooted in another locality. A critique of this exceptional asymmetry built on a history of colonialism and exploitation must be persistent and has to inform the curatorial thinking and possibly address lamentable legacies in specialized disciplines like art history and in the common sense itself pervasive in the public culture. The second point would be the fulfillment of the promise of the ethic and the aesthetic of Arte Povera itself, which in its own time and milieu, beginning in the 60s, keenly challenged norms and institutions governing what art should be. And the third concern pertained to the history and the contemporary situation of Philippine art, which should be viewed not as a peripheral diffusion from a perceived center, some kind of a provincial variation of a metropolitan theme, but rather as a conversation, or in fact an interlocution and remediation from a particular place. A process that could offer a perspective on how to understand arte povera in Italy and elsewhere as a mutating form and not a collection of prestigious objects in an exhibition. Indeed, at this point, we should be able to think through what these interactions signify, and that these terms are contingent and shifting, never fixed and final. This was the conceptual landscape of the exhibition, and as a curator, I always look at exhibitions as opportunities to explore knowledge systems through theoretical and artistic practice. It is for this reason that in this project, I turned to the work of Brenda Fajardo. The title of the exhibition is lifted from the monograph of Fajardo, a creative agent of broad sympathies, artist, mentor, assembler, world maker, farmer, who works in the mingling fields of theater, painting, academe, and civil society. In the early 80s, she wrote a monograph for the Philippine Educational Theater Association, or PETA, titled Aesthetics of Poverty, in which she speaks of how the attrition of material, that's her phrase, indexes an aesthetic and an atmosphere. The ethical is central in this discourse, as Fajardo asks, and I quote her, how can an artist claim to be socially responsible when he mounts high-cost productions during times of deprivation? Her idea of the aesthetics of poverty begins with the artist's responsiveness to an encompassing but transformable world. Such attentiveness leads the artist to choose deliberately particular nuances and tones of color and texture that would express the qualities to be perceived in the world: economic deprivation, cultural pollution, senseless violence, in Fajardo's words. In doing so, a new art emerges. Fajardo marks this as, and I quote her, authentic, because it expresses life which happens to be poor. This is how an aesthetics of poverty takes root and ultimately implies a sense of beauty, according to Fajardo, which belongs to people who live in a condition of material deprivation. There are concepts of color, line, space, texture, and rhythm, and movement that are conditioned by particular natural, cultural, and social environments. It is a result of a particular quality of life that is conditioned by its reality. Such a quality pertains to the viewer's reception and the artist's faculty. And I quote her, we began to capture the patina of time and became more sensitive to the aesthetic qualities of our materials, thereby increasing our powers of expression. With arte povera and aesthetics of poverty constellated, the deep-seated discriminations within art forms and art geographies are dispersed, and the agency to reorganize the order of things is redistributed. Finally, the Philippine articulation becomes an equivalent and has ceased to merely serve as a native informant or a pale version of the supposedly superior source or origin. In turn, the Italian arte povera becomes vulnerable and open to recontextualization, curatorially and art historically. I was moreover interested in the productive problem of the gaps in time and place, that arte povera in Italy and contemporary art in the Philippines were not strictly aligned at various levels in terms of the moment of emergence and its unfolding. I am drawn to these non-alignments as well as to the disparities and rough edges that do not permit convenient synchronizations of art histories from different places. With this curatorial orientation came the ecology itself of the site of the exhibition in relation to arte povera. This is important because the ecology animates both the arte and the povera in the historical life world. And if the exhibition takes place in the Philippines, the curator necessarily has to consider how working in an ecology of intense variations, a homeland of exceptional migrations, and a social milieu shaped by dense translations across a history of successive colonialisms, Filipino artists have bred an instinct and an intelligence of practical politics. It is inspired by the desire to prevail and the ethical commitment to do what is right for a place often visited by calamity and betrayed by governments. Surely, scarcity is an impulse, though not the sole impetus. To make do and dream up is both article of faith and everyday errand. What works is what works. This exhibition materializes the intuition and the insight honed in the critical awareness of poverty, its deep structure and the chance of its transfiguration in a variety of efforts and inspirations, all prompted by the hope that to make do and to dream up is to transform the everyday in textile or film gathered here and there, wood that becomes church or rag that turns into house, stainless steel photocopy and tarpaulin that finally morph into eccentric sound and elusive image. Key in Fajardo's reflections for the monograph is experience, perhaps in conversation with the philosopher John Dewey, who said that gardening in schools affords an avenue of approach to the knowledge of the place farming and horticulture have had in the history of the human race, and which they occupy in present social organization. Carried on in an environment educationally controlled, they are means for making a study of facts of growth, the chemistry of soil, the role of light, air, moisture, injurious and helpful animal life. The monograph opens precisely with Dewey's argument on the intimate relationship between experience and ecology, which shapes the senses of the creator and the receiver of art. Fajardo recognizes that always held in a sensitive relationship are the expressivity of art, its internal power on the one hand, and the material forces that make it possible on the other. Thus, as art possesses integrity and intelligence, so does it demonstrate its materiality. It is at this instance that Fajardo foregrounds the concept of social value. The value is honed in the life of forms, the techniques of their making. This value is deemed social, immersed in the social, and simultaneously immerses the social. The phrase social value tends to surmount the duality between form and content. Both are part of a circuit, of a bundle of nerves, if so to speak. Like this phrase, the formulation aesthetics of poverty is textured. It is usually thought that aesthetics belongs to a rarefied realm of privileged sensibility, and that poverty can never aspire to be part of it because it exemplifies the failure to transcend. Aesthetics is supposedly a consummation, an achievement of a high level of feeling and thinking. At the other pole, poverty is deprivation, largely brought about by systemic disproportion. By bringing both terms together, Fajardo takes liberties with language. The paradox proves to be a productive one because it transposes the notion of value as emerging from a context and not foisted upon by a preconceived system that is regarded as always ascendant, dominantly static, like an unchanging doctrine. This brings us to the provocation of the arte povera discourse and the conceptualization of crisis in light of the pandemic and the various responses of society to it. The curator and leading light of arte povera, Germano Chilant, in his introduction to the artistic program of arte povera, begins with a generous acknowledgement of a copious universe. According to him, and I quote, animals, vegetables, and minerals take part in the world of art. The artist feels attracted to their physical, chemical, and biological possibilities. And he begins again to feel magic and marvelous deeds. The alchemist artist organizes living and vegetable matter into them. Chilant then proceeds to identify some of these materials: copper, zinc, earth, water, rivers, land, snow, fire, grass, air, stone, electricity, uranium, sky, weight, gravity, height, growth, etc. Like Prenda Fajardo, Chilant also invokes John Dewey in his explication of how the artist discovers the body, memory, and gestures. And I quote him, "All that which directly lives and thus begins to carry out the sense of life and of nature, a sense that implies, according to Dewey, numerous subjects, the sensory, the sensational, sensitive, impressionable, and sensuous." End of quote. It is in the long term a project of rediscovery of the artist, of magic, growth, precariousness, falseness, and realness. In the end, according to Chilant, art, life, politics, art, life, politics, poverty do not have as an objective the process of the representation of life. They only want to feel, know, perform that which is real, understanding that what is important is not life, work, action, but the condition in which life, work, and action develop themselves. End of quote. This condition that Chilant is talking about may be described as a condition of crisis, and that contemporary artists respond to it with the critique of the condition itself, which may manifest in an array of forms. The crisis could be an emergency like war, a natural disaster, a curtailment of human rights, or scarcity of a staple like rice or oil, or the basic means to survive. It could also be something structural, and therefore seemingly permanent and apocalyptic, like class inequality, racial and sexual violence, or the decline of the planet itself. It is interesting to note that the words crisis and critique are in fact intertwined. The theorist Wendy Brown annotates that, and I quote her, "Critique is an old term that derives from the Greek word krisis." She continues that in ancient Athens, krisis was a jurisprudential term, identified with the art of making distinction, an art considered essential to judging and rectifying an alleged disorder in or of democracy. The process involves sifting and sorting, according to Brown, focused on distinguishing the true from the false, the genuine from the spurious, the beautiful from the ugly, the right from the wrong. Crisis thus comes close to what we would call today deliberation. Beyond antiquity, the word critique and criticism drifted away from crisis and only retained the connection to the field of medicine, which is quite pertinent at the moment. The idea of a critical condition speaks of an emergency, specifically, and I quote Brown, "the crucial stage of a disease in which a decision had to be made but had not yet been reached, indicating that accurate diagnosis and judgments about appropriate interventions potentially stand between life and death. A critical condition is thus a particular kind of call, an urgent call for knowledge, deliberation, judgment, and action to stave off catastrophe." End of quote. This theorization on crisis and critique is instructive as it enables us to think of the ways in which, and I quote Brown, "worldly event or phenomenon, whether a collapsed empire or a diseased body, connects a specific condition with an immediate need to comprehend by sifting, sorting, or separating its elements, to judge and to respond to it." End of quote. In other words, what is critical is also what is vital. Finally, it is important to sketch out the procedures of the artist when they deal with the world of materials, how they put them together, and in doing so, reflect on the conditions from which these materials have been sourced, as well as the inventive talent to propose ways of making things differently, in which art becomes a technology of inspiration as well as of resistance. In other words, what the artists offer are the analysis of situations, technologies, and possibilities of production. These are the cues of their art and the life around it. The word cue is important because it refers to a relational and therefore not a self-sufficient or isolated condition, in which the sensibilities of artists are heightened by the energies, spirits, or forces around them, and because of which are prompted to act on what they sense is going on around them and on their instinct of what about the world and how to transform it. Let us now look at the works of the Filipino artists in the exhibition, who represent 3 generations of practitioners across Philippine art history, the 70s, the 90s, and the present. After this, we will have the good fortune to dialogue with 2 of the artists, Marx Alberto and Yason Banal.
Brenda V. Fajardo wrote the monograph Aesthetics of Poverty, a rationale in designing for Philippine theater around the early 80s. By the time she completed the text, Fajardo had studied agriculture, taught art, Alma Quinto's House of Comfort project began through a series of art workshops with disaster-affected communities all over the Philippines. Using cloth, thread, and needle, the work gathers stories of loss and grief into a soft collage of hope and strength. As each piece is stitched into a larger cloth panel, it creates a collaborative space where communities can communicate and work freely as they document and process the past and its traces. In ghost painting, called the category, Christopher Ardenya characterizes the rural livelihood of Bacolod through its ubiquitous materials. He gathered used clothes from textile stores and ukay-ukay, shops that sell second-hand clothing, some of which were sent as relief goods by donor countries. He then painted and stitched the fabrics together with signages from local schools, creating large collages presented as tarpaulins, an often overlooked yet widely used material in urban and rural contexts. Lirio Salvador appropriates everyday and industrial materials such as bicycle gears, stainless steel pipes, bowls, and utensils to create experimental instruments known as sandata, or weapon, a series of sculptural assemblages. He founded the ethno-industrial band and multidisciplinary art collective Elemento. Their performances, which are central to Salvador's musical and artistic expression, play with the complexity of raw noises produced by his works. In Santiago Bos's unfinished mural, 9/11 Return of the Comeback, the artist superimposes photographs of Filipinos and Americans in the 60s to 70s against Picasso's anti-war painting Guernica. The work recalls the September 11 attacks in the United States, whose aftermath partly caused the return of American military presence in the Philippines, a move Bose described as a rehash of the American occupation. Jose Tenze Ruiz's work in this exhibition is part of his series Paraisado, which is a convergence of ornate cathedral towers and the humble cariton, a makeshift wooden cart commonly used by the urban poor for trade and survival. The incongruity of these two attributes lays bare the evident gaps between structures and agents in society and the astute talent of the Filipino bricoleur. Sea Rafts by Marx Alberto was first presented in 2011 and is based on his encounters and experiences of Manila floods in 2009 when Typhoon Ondoy ravaged Metro Manila. Ordinary objects were transformed into complex narratives of the private and the public, survival and threat, game and play. Rafts made out of everyday objects make the viewer rethink perceptions on fear and doubt in relation to the instinct of surviving a disaster. Through these objects, multiple layers of relations and functions are crafted and constructed, further exploring the idea of transportation, movement, consumerism, security, urbanism, and the everyday politics in the age of climate change. Overlapping videos, archival photographs, and other various objects make up Yason Banal's installation, with pleasure no tears, a knife and a slice of the plutocrat life. This work examines the extraordinary everyday of elite power and critiques their industrial and corporate mentality that inform and affect the material and cognitive poverty of others. It emphasizes that contemporary materiality is subjected to the aesthetic cues of power, which in turn are challenged by the resistant aesthetics of poverty, calling for the emancipation from oppressive systems defined by a culture of domination. In Poklong Anading's works for the exhibition, he collected the seeming detritus of his urban neighborhood, making use of rubble from sewage and roadworks, as well as recovered rags made of waste fabric from textile industries. The installation, composed of 3 individual works, examines the uneven conditions of the urban life world and the creative instincts of its inhabitants. The exhibition, Cue from Life Itself, Filipino Artists Transform the Everyday, can be accessed from your homes at metmuseum.ph.
So thank you to the Met staff for preparing that video. We now move into the conversation with the artist, and we begin with Mark Salvatus. Mark, hello. Thank you for making time to be with us. Maybe just a short introduction of your practice.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Salamat sa Met and to everyone who's here. So my name is Mark Salvatus, and I'm originally from Lucban, Quezon. But for the past several years, I'm based in Manila, in Quezon City. And I studied advertising, so different from studio art. So I think I can start how my practice works, and also my background as a street artist. And my practice deals with a lot of movement, and also the idea of unstableness, maybe using different materials, from moving from one materials to another, and different places to another. So Alec is showing some slides of my previous works, and I also deal a lot with the site specificity, and also using found objects, especially, and collecting is one of my process. Collecting, accumulating, and also amassing. I mean, it depends on the materials that I found or I fell in love with. So I think that's process. And I call my overall project a salvage project. And coming from the word salvage, which is the meaning of my surname, Salvatus also. And creating this kind of like tension between the word salvage, because in the context of Philippines, salvage is also different meaning. So I want to try to play with different context, mediums, and yeah. I think that's it.
Thank you, Mark. And
okay.
Yeah, we can finish the slides, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just for context, Mark, in the Philippines, salvage means to execute now.
Yes.
It's a form of judicial execution, which is different from the lexical meaning of salvage, which is the opposite, no? To save, yeah. So that is like an interesting linguistic situation, yeah, in relation to the word salvage. My first question, Mark, has something to do with material. You deal with diverse kinds of materials. So how do you decide on the ways to put them together?
To put, I think maybe first through different life experiences and not really like planning with the big grand planning with my work. It's really through experiences that I got really excited, or maybe the curiosity that I want to work on a project. And the materials is like it's like a roll ball. Like usually I work in a long process through collecting, through repetition, through like a rhythm. And through this, I can maybe develop a project wherein I can really make my own maybe visual language. So as how I put it together, I think it's more random, but at the same time, it's also kind of well well executed or something like that. And I think I'm also interested because because I started I grew up in Lokban, Quezon, and I think one of my first exposure to art is the idea of pahiyas, which is putting things together, which is also in a way it's random putting things of different materials that the people have in my hometown. So I think this kind of like process, or you kind of see this pattern every year you see. So you planning is not really part of the overall put, but it's more onto the instinct maybe also. So I think this kind of putting things together is like not stable. Which is, I think most of my installation or work is also unstable. It talks about unstableness, and it's not not fixed or not permanent.
Yeah.
So I think I decide on that. So I'm pretty much conscious that my works are unstable. Also, maybe the same with as a person, unstable with the country, with the many things happening.
Yeah, so I think that instability also speaks, Mark, to this condition of crisis, no? And also allows you as an artist to develop an instinct on how to respond to this instability. So my second question is, if you reflect on your history of your artistic formation, what do you think has prepared you to acquire and activate specific skills? I think you mentioned some already, but maybe you can add more to that.
Yeah, as I mentioned I was exposed to this tradition of pahiyas, not the tourism side, but the idea of communal, putting things together and using whatever they have in the community. So I think maybe the practice of also, I think I will also mention that I also started when I was already in Manila as a street artist. And I think that developed my sense of the city also, a sense of the environment, sense of space also. So I think this kind of like practice, which doesn't revolve around the studio, creates my urge to look on things outside the studio. I mean, right now we cannot go out that much, but I think it started because of like not having a studio before, and then just using the public transportation. I think this kind of like act of the repetition every day, you go out and then you kind of sense or feel the environment, and that's how you maybe develop this kind of like practice. So like, for example, this Siraf, it's because of the experiences. It also talks about public and private, because most of the works or the objects I found is private, but it's being used publicly in the context of a flood or something.
Yeah, yeah. And then finally, Mark, the I'm interested in the ideas of ingenuity or resilience, which have often been used to describe the Filipino spirit in the face of crisis, usually in a romantic and affirmative register. No? What do you think of these terms like resilience, ingenuity, and can we describe the Filipino spirit beyond these terms? I mean, it's nice to hear these words, but I'm sure there are also problems that go with them. But what do you think of this?
Thank you for that question. I'm being more resilient because of that question. So I think the word resilient, I don't know who are the one who wrote about this resiliency about Filipinos or the Philippines. Is it the people who experience the disaster or the calamities or the hardship? I don't know if they will talk about resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on who is the narrator of that resiliency. Maybe, of course, some writer or anyone who will write about resiliency in the Philippines, maybe he didn't experience that. I don't know. So I think I'm more interested on the small narrative of the people in general, not like being resilient. So as you mentioned, what can be another spirit or Filipino spirit can be, it can be maybe the belief or it's not resilient, but it's the belief from one's own, but it can be also become communal or collective, like what's the Tagalog of belief? Like
Paniniwala.
Paniniwala. So you believe, you're naniniwala. It's something, and also the idea of paniniwala can connect to imagination rather than ingenuity or creativity. Because creativity, I think, is more productive, or you need to produce. But imagination is just there. I mean, it's something that's there, but you cannot see. It's like when someone says, "Oh, there's a ghost," but people will just say, "Oh, it's just your imagination." But I think that's important. It's there, but it's not there. I don't know. So, but creativity, ingenuity is being used for like for production or creativity or neoliberal sense of moving forward. So I think we need maybe more imagination rather than resilience. I don't know, or ingenuity.
Yeah, I think what's important is for us to be more aware of the implications when we use these terms. Now that they're not supposed to be used as a matter of fact, but as with a certain critical attitude towards these terms. We will now move on. Thank you, Mark, for responding, and we'll get back to you later for a general Q&A. Now we move on with Yason. Yason, hello. Thank you for making the time. Are you with us? Okay. Are you on already? Okay, so maybe I like Mark, maybe a few words to introduce your practice generally. Yason?
Hi, Patrick. Hello sa lahat. Thank you for having me. This very interesting and timely conversation. So just a short intro lang. As indicated, so yung practice ko will work in different form and media. Including video, text, sculpture, installation. It's also interested in employing critical and poetic strategies, and also interested sa intersections among various systems. These systems may include, depending on the project, like art or art history, popular culture, cinema, geopolitics, institutional life, and statecraft. So within these systems, I like looking into the possible materials inherent in them, and then maybe possible crossing over to ideas of the other systems. So yun, so materials, ideas, data also. I'm also interested in research through these kind of different methods, hopefully exploring these intersections, conditions also, and mysteries, para may sense of play pa rin amongst these various systems.
Yeah.
So the images I included are from the recent ones from the past 3 years, and involve pretty much yun, kind of sustained in like interest in abstraction and documentary, and how they are also employed, no, by power structures. Yun.
Yeah, so thank you, Yason. I think you partly already answered my first question. Maybe just a way to follow through the question on materials and the choice of materials. The question is, where do you look for these materials?
I like siguro yung sa pagtuturo rin, parang I like to work on exhibition idea. So maraming factors. So for example, yung sa cue from life, while a particular exhibit may existing concerns na yung artist, tapos yun yung pwedeng mag-challenge para mag-extend na mag-engage doon. So the exhibition for sure is a conduit for exploration of materials, and then the existing concerns ng artist, tapos yung formal aspects ng material, whether kunwari sa Met Museum show, kunwari yung slice ng Manila Film Center, that's particular to the show na ano kaya yung materiality nitong 3D print, no, or yung slice lang ng model. Tapos siguro yung last na yung parang siguro yung social resonance, or iba-iba, pwedeng conceptual, poetic, or ano man, na resonance nitong formal material. So what yung pwede kayang charge niya, whether sa akin or sa iba. So including, for example, yung archive ng Met Museum, a particular, in another context, siguro in another show, not in the Met, it would be different. So it was, for me, such a generous gesture on the part of the museum staff. So for me, those things, while they seem to be immaterial, the gestures are, for me, also part of it, kasi it's a form of transaction that, ang ganda na sinabi mo kanina about conditions, that these immaterial conditions might actually also be fruitful in terms of, choosing materials, while not maybe easily visible right away, help create that visuality.
In a way, that sentiment, Yason, speaks to the comment of Mark earlier about this imagination, things that you don't see, but actually creates that condition for you to do something, which need not translate into an object, or a form of production that can circulate maybe economically. So the other question is, you work with moving images and sonic materials a lot, Yason. How do you conceptualize them in the context of an installation? Like how do they become an installation? Yeah.
Parang si Mark, parang marami tayong interest. So ako yung interest ko sa film, sa visual arts, parang marami tayong visual arts, everyday life rin, syempre. At yun nga, for example, the one that we're seeing now is an kind of a three-pronged project. Pwede tayo mag-stop doon sa kanina, the previous slide. the starting off point was like a chroma painting. So I made chroma paintings using blue and green. Yun, green and blue painting. Galing rin ako sa film na na-interest ako bigla na parang uy, paano kaya ko itong abstract blue at green ay maging chroma painting. So the notion of abstraction can now be prop blue and green, can actually be
Hello. I think we have,
can you
I think, Yason, we have problems with your connection. Can you still hear us? Hello. So maybe we can proceed to the Q&A, and I hope that Yason can rejoin us. Na? So do we do that, Matt? We do that, no?
Yes, sir. We can proceed with the Q&A.
Okay.
And we'll wait for Yason.
So there's a question here from the floor about, and maybe only Mark can answer now. Mark, are you still here?
Yes.
In relation to this specific crisis, how did your art respond to that? Because we've been talking about your body of work over time, but the audience is interested in this specific moment of crisis in relation to your work. So do you have thoughts on what you have been doing since the lockdown in March?
Lockdown.
Yeah.
I think during the first few weeks, months, I cannot really work. So I think I'm also locked down mentally. So so I think that's I mean, it's nice also to reflect, not only to make work during this time of crisis, because it's the only time we can maybe slow down and look back. So I think looking back is also good way in checking or rechecking what have you been doing in the past few years. And
both
I
of us.
think
But
it's
Mark,
also
or for me.
Yes,
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, Yason. I'm first talking to Mark, and then later I can go back to you. Is that okay? Okay. Sige, Mark, please continue.
So I've been doing some going back to my old projects and works, and I think some kind of small writings and notes about so I think that's one thing that I've been doing in this but like responding to the lockdown or to the situation now. It's not maybe like making grand works or new works that can maybe change or alleviate the things that's happening. But I've been doing some small works for my son in the house. So in a way, it's kind of also, in a way, productive for him, maybe, because I make him busy because he cannot really go out. And I think it's one way to create also, or make something in this kind of situation, like more relationship, or not really not really like responding, but creating relationship.
So I think what this pandemic has taught us is this this need to reflect on locality again. No? What it means to be local, because we cannot move. No? So in this particular case, the locality is the home. No?
Yeah.
And then the microecology of the family, no, is it's quite an interesting thing to say. Thank you, Mark. And Yason, are you? Can you respond now, Yason? Well, he is still frozen. So we go back to Mark. And Mark, you are also part of this community, no? This community of artists. No? You've been involved in gathering people in different ways and forming communities. So how's that relationship with them now that you cannot really come together, because the impulse of community making is gathering people together, but now you're isolated and you're confined to your own quarantine. So how do you conceptualize community in this situation of the pandemic?
I think we are very, lucky to have this, not really lucky, but it's like the technology now is, most of us, for example, the artists that we know and like locally and also abroad are more talking now online. So I think before it's just like checking or liking, but now there's more connection, I guess. There's more like checking, how are you? And of course, there's an urge also of like talking, because talking is, or like chatting is an important way to communicate for us, even though it's not face to face. So I think this like informalness of creating a community is happened during this time of COVID or crisis, because everyone is affected. Everyone's project or exhibition or gigs are suspended. So everyone is suspended. Everyone is hanging. So in a way, the small pockets of community are the one who can share their thoughts also. So I think during this time of crisis also, many communities arise or was like calling for donation, calling not only for the artist, but with a certain community. So, yeah.
Yeah. So Yason, you can join.
Thank you. Sorry, naka-phone data lang ako ito. Kaya nagwa-wobbly yung mahangin. So, pero yun, medyo okay na. Nag-load na uli. Nag-load na.
That's really the an instance of povera, maybe. Anyway,
true.
We just maybe just to pick up. This is for Yason. Just to pick up the line of questioning earlier. Just the last question from me, Yason. So how and when does social information enter the picture of your production? When does the social come in? I think it's Mark, wala pa rin, no?
Yes, social, I think yung Filipinos were pretty much, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
But a bit patchy, Yason.
Sorry.
Well, anyway, let's try. Sige.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, the social information comes from different things. So from current events to the different systems I mentioned earlier, which are also, in a way, from art history to cinema to pop culture to geopolitics are all part and parcel of social. Tapos, siguro just to add, sorry, yun nga, choppy. Pero yung sinabi rin ni Mark, I think to just extend it to now and other similar conditions that outside of my own work, but I think from the past years, the inspiration, maybe not necessarily social information, but social inspiration has and always been coming from friends and colleagues, especially these days. No, from the university to students to artists, as mentioned, yung collaborations to helping out in different ways, different registers. So they may not necessarily translate to a visible artwork, but as mentioned, parang kanina yung mga immaterial conditions na pwedeng mag-feed pa rin. No? So, kunwari ano yung configuration ng video, not just in terms of the data or the narrative, but possibly, yun nga, no? Being surrounded by the social, what kind of contribution or engagement would we want to do. So these, in a way, times of crisis can also you know, reconfigure certain ways of getting information or techniques on how we use this information.
Yeah, because I think that's also the point of Chelant and Fajardo, no? That it's the condition that is central in the production of form, no? There's a question here for both of you, since you participated in the Venice Biennale, in the architecture sections of the Philippine pavilions. What do you guys think, this is from Franz Rilla, of the artistic connection of the Italians and Filipinos, now that we have this conversational exhibition between Italy and the Philippines? So when you were invited to be part of the of the exhibition, what were your initial thoughts, and were those thoughts changed in the course of your work for the exhibition? So yeah.
Mark?
Yes.
Okay. Parang interesting yung architecture at interesting na si Mark rin pala. Kasi parang, kasi fan rin ako ng architecture, kahit hindi naman ako at all expert. Pero yung interest ko of how certain architectural mechanisms of yun nga, of state or corporate or institutional power. So, but in terms of Venice, I think, I remember when I got invited, I really, yun, parang had, I think it was also the time I wanted to engage, not so much in the Biennale, but in the interest of the theme, which is about neoliberalism and colonialism, that I felt like, while parang regardless na siya of Venice, but really just the idea of how architecture is so embedded in the neoliberal and the colonial. So yun yung na-interest. Tapos yung sa Venice, syempre, siya yung kumbaga sinasabing malaking venue for that. Pero hindi siya yung primary. And I think just fast forward to now, what I think is interesting is how, as mentioned already by both of us kanina na ni Mark, yung solidarities, no, regardless of geographies or lessons we can learn from the past also. While Venice may seem to be the the first world, the pandemic has really brought everyone to its, in a way, kind of metaphorically, to its knees. So I didn't take pleasure that, Venice is something that's, but Italy was also a very hit. So, and I remember when we were installing there, and I'm sure baka sa experience nyo rin kayo ni Patrick, na binabahan na yung Venice noon, di ba? So parang kind of interesting na how art really in that sense, no, can be both a portal to open people's minds and to engage in discourses and artworks that could be really mind-opening, but at the same time on a practical level, from tourism to free market, has also caused so much damage to the city. So,
yeah, thank you. Yason. Mark, did you like to respond?
Yeah, I think the Venice participation is interesting because it's a group of architects and artists, and then it's not really about collaboration, but we have our own individual projects. And it's interesting, we come up with different projects, especially with the architects and the visual artists, because I think this is also good reflection on how maybe architects are really working. It's really the stableness that they look for or they see, but in the artist side, it's more onto the unstableness. So I think this is a good conversation in with this participation, but I'm more interested when the exhibit was brought back to the Philippines, because I'm not sure if the Italians or the other viewers of the Venice will really react to that. But it's nice that it came back, because it really shows how architecture is, or urbanism is, in Philippine context, and how architects see it and how artists see it.
Okay. There's a question for both of you on process. And maybe this is one of the last questions, last question, no? Because you work with found objects, and then the person would like to ask if, where do you begin? With the object or with the idea? Or maybe that's a wrong question to ask in light of the Arte Povera program of Chelant, and also the Aesthetics of Poverty program of Fajardo. I mean, the form and content, idea and material binarism doesn't hold water anymore. But it's a process question, no? It's a process question. So if you are asked that question, how would you respond?
Siguro dun, like what you said, Patrick, yung I think nagko-coexist siya na pwedeng idea becomes the object. Parang merong minsan, nakita ka lang, kunwari ako yun, yung Manila Film Center, just I can't get it out. You know, both as an image, as a narrative, as sculptural. So parang pwede na siyang fuel, kumbaga. Or, kunwari, yung the past, certain works, yung interested in low broadband, you know, as a kind of poor accessibility. You know? So parang hindi naman siya, yung low broadband ng Pilipinas, hindi naman siya material per se or ano, pero para lang siyang, yun, para siyang
foundation.
Starting off point siguro.
Yeah. Thank you. And Mark,
Chicken
or the egg yan.
Chicken or egg, tama. But I think it's maybe prito na or nilaga na. So I think it's hand in hand that the egg is boiled. So I think the material and then the idea is prito na nga. I think it's in the middle. So because materials, we experience through materials. And through this experience, it's like how you maybe formulate your idea. So that's why I think collecting is one process of my of my practice. So I don't know if I will use it or not, but I think once you develop some kind of like intimacy with the object, because you've been using the phone or you're using the T-shirt for a long time, it creates some kind of like context or idea. So I think it's the pagluluto, the pagprito ng itlog. So
yeah, as practical as that. The last question, I will conjoin two concerns from the participants. One is, in a survey done, this is from Don Atienza, whom we all know. In a survey done in Singapore, people voted artists as the most non-essential job during this pandemic. How do you respond to this? And then maybe just so that this ends in an inspirational note, what can you advise young artists during this time of pandemic? So maybe you can think of your answer in relation to those two questions as one. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Parang roller coaster times talaga ngayon, diba? Parang, and I think yung practice ng education is at yung art practice ever since kasi I've been teaching has really taught me a lot and humbled me a lot, especially in these times. That it's a lot of, I think that kind of humbling experience to reconfigure things. I think it's never to recalibrate configure. But then also I've been so inspired by yun nga mentioned ko na by other actions and by other activities from people, organizations, communities. So in that sense, yung artistic practice should not, and I'm sure a lot naman are aware, that should not be limited to art market. I think that that is important for sure, and I think it was. And it exists globally. I think it's important for people to have a livelihood. But I think what in this times of crisis, what has been so inspiring to me is that the difficulties are there, and it should be engaged in, and should critique and voice out if necessary. But also at the same time, it for me gave a realization also that there's something bigger than the art market. There's something bigger than the art world, which for me is the art community. For me, the art community is that configuration that may have been part of both art market and art world, but the art community through practice that may not necessarily be leading to objects, even just examples of my student works that have been so affected by the crisis, but have chosen to finish their work, even if we already opted for a universal pass. Remember, we fought for that. That means that there's calling beyond, beyond, of course, material needs. At importante yun. Kung wala kang kinakain, di ba? Ang problematic naman na maging idealistic. I think yun na lang yung siguro yung nakukuha nating lakas sa isa't isa. At kahit ngayon yung mga messaging na, kahit nga Facebook, hindi ako na-interest services, but ngayon parang nakikita ko siya. Merong mga dating hindi nakikitang portals na hindi necessary. But I think it's not so much because of these certain forms that are problematic, but maybe the motivations for engaging in such a form. So I don't know if that answers the question. Ang ganda kasi yung tanong, siguro pag-isipan ko pa. But I think for artists now, I think from what I've been seeing, I'm so amazed also. So amazed. What I see on like mga message or mga fundraising, kitchens, relief efforts, writing, filmmaking in their homes, new forms will emerge.
Yeah.
Even cinema, I think moving image, what is sculpture if you're dealing with 3 canned goods na binigay na binigay. So baka yun yung, at I think marami namang lessons from the past, from the depression to racial tensions to colonialism. So wag masiraan ng loob. At yung nagagamit ko nga ngayon palagi yung pangwakas palagi ng isang estudyante ay Yason, pakatatag lagi. At yun yung never ko nasasabi before. And I think yun para sa mga artists siguro at hindi artists na yun yung essence, yun yung essentiality ng artists, yung in times of crisis, accounting, law, medicine, of course they have their problems, but the imagination, thinking, generosity, those are seemingly immaterial aspects, but that's what art can do, and so hopefully yun nga, wag masiraan ng loob at patuloy lang yung pakikibaka at pagtulong sa isa't isa.
Wag din masiraan ng bait, no? Anyway, si Mark. Mark, yeah. Yeah, last.
Thank you sa mga inspiring words, si Yason. It's nice because gusto ko ring balikan yung wag mawala ng loob or masiraan ng loob. Kasi it's the loob is the inner side, so and then the imagination from inside to outside. So I think that's essential. I mean, hindi ko alam, I don't know kung ano yung categorization ng Singapore, which is essential. So I think it's more onto the productive side ng worker or the essential workers. But I think in the artist sense here, the most productive or the most who are making generous support are the artists or the the cultural workers and other people who don't have a position. So parang they position themselves because there's no other na na may position. So I think the loob is lalabas. So the imagination, some kind of parang ganon. So I think for the younger generation, yeah, sabi nga niya, so wag masiraan ang loob at bait. So
Okay. So thank you, Mark and Yason, for this lively conversation. I now turn you over to Tina Colayco. Yeah. Tina?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Thank you, Patrick, for your thought-provoking presentation earlier. Mark and Yason, thank you for your honest and open sharing of the realities that we can all definitely relate to. And to all of you who have joined us this afternoon, thank you so much for giving us your time for this webinar. And we hope you can join us again for our future events. So let's keep the conversation going. You can send in comments and questions for our speakers today. Dan and Alec and the rest of the Met team will be virtually available for you. So stay safe, everyone, and thank you again.
thank you. Salamat.
Thank you.
Thank you.